Gators Breakdown, the Gators fan podcast, because there's never a dull moment in Gator Nation.
The Gators Breakdown podcast is ready to go. I'm your host, David Waters, and you can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. I am joined by co-host Will Miles. You can find him on Twitter at WillMilesSEC and at readandreaction.com. Will, man, big episode here. Kind of unexpected episode for some things. We were planning on doing a recruiting episode anyway. And, you know, you were releasing an article at Read and Reaction. Anyway, talking about recruiting and some stuff about recruiting. And then the end of last week happened where, you know, Tennessee gets on fire in recruiting. Kamar Wilcoxon commits to Tennessee. Florida has a decommitment. And, you know, we thought it would just be nice anyway to give a recruiting update heading into May. And then little did we know the end of last week and over the weekend, recruiting would kind of just catch on fire. And then right before, about an hour and a half before we come here on Gators Breakdown, we get word of a transfer. True freshman Isiah Walker will enter the transfer portal. Remains to be seen if he'll actually transfer out of Florida, but it's putting his name into the transfer portal. Will, man, it's recruiting is the roller coaster that never stops. And of course, the moniker Gators Breakdown, there's never a dull moment in Gator Nation. It rings true, my friend.
Yeah, we were all prepared for this episode, but now we're wishing we weren't prepared for this episode based on what's going on with the program right now. And for the second year in a row now, we got a guy who's likely not going to make it to fall camp, and that's a real problem when you're bringing in people, high level 4- and 5-star guys who decide to leave before they ever take a snap in the fall. And obviously things are weird right now with the coronavirus, not being on campus. It's just a very weird time. So I do think there's probably some things that normally wouldn't go on that are going on. But at the same time, every other program has to deal with the same thing. We sort of talked about that last week, that when it comes to on the field stuff, no one's going to feel sorry for you. Everybody has to deal with the same thing. And it's the same thing when it has to do with recruiting, right? Is nobody's going to feel sorry for you. Everybody's dealing with the same sort of situations and issues. And when, hopefully Walker comes back. If he doesn't, hopefully he finds a place that's good for him. But it is disturbing to see yet again in recruiting that Florida's struggling in a way that you wouldn't really expect for a program like Florida and a program that's won like Florida has under Mullen.
Absolutely. So, we'll get into all the talk here of everything going on. A lot of news out there right now in Gator Nation, of course. I mean, Will and I will have you covered there. But before we get into the episode, Will, I'm going to let you be a proud pop here. And, of course, a lot of you over the weekend have noticed, Will's daughter, Amelia, releasing a book. So, Will, I'll let you take it from here and, hopefully give our Gators Breakdown listeners and Gator Nation kind of something to look forward to.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. So here it is. This is the book. If you can see it on YouTube, it's called The Gator Gang Gets Groceries. So maybe about a year ago, Amelia and I were going for a walk, and I asked her if she'd like to write a book with me, or a children's book, and she said, yeah. And I was like, all right, well, we'll see what comes of this. And then she went home and she drew out her characters, and she started storyboarding the thing. And she and I went back and forth a little bit about the details, but here it is a year later, and she's got a fully finished book that's up on Amazon. And actually, thank you to everybody who follows me on Twitter or Facebook or my mailing list, because she was up to number 2 in children's sports books today on the new release list. So it's been a pretty successful launch, and she's really obviously excited about it. So she's 11 years old. So this is sort of a cool experience for her. And it was just sort of a good father-daughter thing to do, but it's a cool story, really. It's about her and her brothers are Gators. They each have different personality quirks that match very closely with each of the kids, and they use they individually they're unable to defeat a bulldog from Georgia, a coonhound from Tennessee, and a tiger from Louisiana. But when they band together, they're able to figure out how to get past them. So kind of a cool a cool story, and she tinted it with just enough Gator stuff to make it interesting for me. So it's really cool to see, and she was lighting up yesterday at all the comments people were making, and people messaging me telling me they were buying it. So thank you very much for everybody who has, and if you get an opportunity, if you go to readandreaction.com/Amelia, there's a link. There's also a link on the main page to the book. It's up on Amazon, and we'd be thrilled if you buy it. And we've actually had some people who have offered to donate it to people who have been furloughed or who are in need. So if you're in that situation, feel free to reach out to me, and we'll make sure you get a book.
Yeah, absolutely. I got mine ordered, Will. It should be here tomorrow there. So, we'll see how all that goes, but definitely ready to let Hadley read it and let her experience some a cool, children's Gator story. There's not many of these types of books out there. So I think that's one thing I think Amelia has going for her, that it would be cool to see so many Gator kids, growing up with a story that, hey, down the road is kind of a staple in Gator families.
Well, hey, you ought to buy it for all your friends who like Georgia, because
Yes.
they defeat Kirby the Bulldog going along the way. So we absolutely need to get them for all the Georgia fans out there, and make sure we indoctrinate the kids in those families so they don't make a wrong choice when they turn 18.
Yeah, absolutely. So as Will said, you can definitely go purchase it on Amazon. Go search for it and find it there. So, and look, I know there's a lot going on out there, but I wanted to thank everyone who's reached out, listened to the show, shared it, interacted on Twitter. Hope you're getting some type of distraction out there. With everything going on. So, hopefully, Gators Breakdown, we're giving you some type of distraction with everything going on. Still trying to provide you guys with all the Gators football talk you can handle. And while we may not agree on everything, the conversations and debates, keep it pretty fun. Keep it pretty fun out there. So, whether you're from Gainesville, Jacksonville, Tampa, Miami, Orlando, Lakeland, Chuliota, or outside the state of Florida, thanks very much for listening to Gators Breakdown. And, you keep going it, keep bringing it, and that's what we're going to do here as well on Gators Breakdown. Remember, you can find Gators Breakdown on news4jax.com/Gators Breakdown. You find all the Gators Breakdown episodes there, as well as News4Jax coverage of the Gators. So please share, rate, and review the show. Subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform. Follow Gators Breakdown on social media, on Twitter and Facebook at Gators Breakdown. So, well, let's get into the bit of the breaking news here. As I said, about an hour and a half ago before we started recording here, not good news for the Gators. Freshman offensive tackle Isiah Walker decides to transfer out of Florida before even playing it down for the Gators. Look, Will, he's supposed to play a large role in providing at least some depth for the Gators in 2020. He's supposed to go through spring ball, push for maybe even a starting position, and he'll never suit up in orange and blue. And now a true freshman, leaving, putting himself into the transfer portal was odd news in and of itself. But at Florida, as you kind of alluded to earlier, second year in a row where highly rated prospects are no longer part of the program before the first snap of their freshman season. Chris Steele last year, Jalen Jones last year. And just two that you can point to there. So another part of this, Will, and it's just kind of, really odd timing on top of it with everything going on out there. These students are not even on campus. Walker sent out some vague, worrisome tweets a few weeks ago. So, hope all is fine there with him. And, there's probably some stuff behind the scenes that don't, need to see the light of day. But on the surface of what this means for the Gator team, it isn't good, Will. There's no spin here in this department. A position of need, a highly rated prospect that, we plan to be on this offensive line for years to come. And as of right now, he's putting his name into the transfer portal and may never play as a Gator.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing he said there is position of need, right? So when Chris Steele went back to the West Coast last year, one, it was kind of expected because you get guys who come from the West Coast and get homesick and go back and those sorts of things. It was a little bit surprising it happened as early as it did, but there were also sort of the extenuating circumstances with Jalen Jones that were tied into that as well. In this case, you've got and there you had Kyrie Elam as a backup, and certainly somebody who proved that he was more than capable to step in at the end of last season. I think now, though, offensive line was a place where Florida really struggled last year, where guys like Ethan White came in their true freshman year and were able to prove that they were able to get in there and get snaps and get playing time if they were good enough. And then you look at Walker. I mean, he's 156th national recruit in the class of 2020. at offensive tackle, which also means that he's athletic enough that if you wanted to move him into guard to get him playing time, you'd probably be able to do that. And, he was sort of one of the big time offensive lineman recruits that you looked at and said, hey, they're building something there on the offensive line. Maybe the 2019 offensive line wasn't great, but in 2020, 2021, and 2022, it's going to be a lot better. So, there's a little bit of concern here, I think, that you're losing somebody at a position of need, because that's a place where you would expect to be able to hold on to guys, because they're not leaving because they're not getting playing time. They're leaving for some other reason. And hopefully that reason is tied into the well-being of Walker, and we wish him well, obviously. You never want to see somebody do poorly. So, if he doesn't feel like Florida's the place for him, then he'll move on. But obviously it's an issue for Mullen, and you've used an initial counter at this point for this particular spot as well. And that's been sort of a theme as well over the last 2 or 3 years, is using counters on guys who don't ever step on campus or play very minimally and then leave the program. And they're going to have to manage that moving forward. Yeah,
and will fair or not, and probably unfair. We'll see what comes out of this. But of course, the national perception is going to go back to this time last year and what was going on with those other transfers. Because remember, you go back a year ago, Florida was getting slung through the mud a bit with all the, the Jalen Jones and Chris Steele situation, and, what's going on in Gainesville? Why are players leaving so early and all that? Now this is just an extension of that. Just 1 year later, that, we're hearing this again about another highly rated prospect, and not necessarily, and it doesn't really matter how highly rated of a prospect Walker is. Of course, it's going to probably garner more headlines because of that. But people would have started doing some digging, no matter who it was. If it was a 2-star, 3-star, that doesn't matter. You start seeing true freshmen not ever play it down. And don't get me wrong, it from the outside and even from the inside, even closer to the program, it is a weird look. I'll fully admit that. If you're in California or you're in Ohio or Michigan and you see the headline 2 years in a row, true freshman leaves University of Florida, it puts his name into the transfer portal. It is a weird look. And, we're a little bit closer, and we know some kind of the extenuating circumstances that were happening last year with Jalen Jones and Chris Steele, and maybe even with this one here. But as I said, this, of course, the national perception is going to be, again, what's going on in Gainesville? Why can't they keep kids that they just recently signed?
Well, man, I think it should be, right? I think there are questions that need to be asked. I think if this were Miami or Florida State or Georgia or Alabama, maybe not Alabama because they've done so well, but if it was any of Florida's main rivals, we'd be making fun of them for something like this and talking about the dysfunction and talking about what kind of organization they have and all those sorts of things. And I think those are legitimate questions. It doesn't mean that Mullen's doing anything wrong. It doesn't mean that there are issues, but it is an indication that there are things that may need to be corrected, or at least there are questions that need to be asked. And I certainly hope that people get the opportunity to do that. I think it's, there's at a very high level, the recruiting at Florida under Mullen has been better than McElwain, but has not been good enough for what you think is going to be necessary to win the SEC or win a national championship. And in order to offset the gap between where Florida is and where Florida needs to be, you can't have guys leaving the program. And you mentioned that it wouldn't have mattered how highly rated that Walker is, but I do think that it matters from the standpoint of who didn't commit because Walker was in the fold, and in the fold relatively early too. Was there an offensive lineman they could have taken who was rated, 190th, who decided to go someplace else because he knew he was going to be behind Walker? Was there, maybe 2 3-star guys who were pretty good that 3 years from now will be really good players who didn't come because they were going to be behind Walker and Braun? And you just can't, you don't know what that is. The biggest thing is that it's a waste of the resources that you have. You've got 25 initial counters every year. You've got 85 scholarships. Obviously 25 counters a year adds up to 100. So you're going to have some attrition, but you're going to have attrition due to disciplinary reasons. You're going to have attrition due to injuries. And if you have attrition because you didn't vet the guys coming in well enough to where they're leaving before they ever really get an opportunity to come in, I think it's legitimate that there should be questions asked. Again, I'm not saying that there's something wrong or that there's something that's untoward going on. I'm just saying, if it was a rival, I'd be asking the question. I'd certainly probably be ragging on my friends who are fans of that program too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So Now, we'll see the fallout of this, of course, and what's gonna, maybe we'll get more news in the next couple of days. I don't know if Florida will send anything out, of course, and in regards to this. So we'll see. We'll see where it goes from here, and we'll keep our eyes open and our ears open as well to kind of maybe see if we hear anything in regards to this and what happened here. So. All right, well, let's move forward into what our episode was going to originally be about before we got that news here about Isiah Walker. And look, I get talking recruiting in May is a tricky subject. I get that many people out there don't worry about, don't worry about recruiting until National Signing Day in December and February. I get that. I respect that. I actually lean more that way myself. But, what happens leading up to those months are just as important out there for some. So, recruiting is a journey. Some choose to follow. It's a roller coaster. There will be some good news. There'll be some bad news. If we can discuss the good news when Florida gets commits and shoots up the rankings, then we can also have, some civil conversation when decommits happen and other schools and rivals shoot up the rankings as well. That's part of it. So, we had plenty of, talk late winter and early spring about how well Florida was doing on the trail and how everything was looking good. Is fluid, no decisions, no ultimatums need to come on anyone based on what's happening right now in May. But we can discuss the peaks and valleys, Will, and the wacky side of college football that is recruiting. So, I hope to look at this from both sides of the argument and listeners out there can make their minds up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when we talk about recruiting and we talk about recruiting at Florida, it's through the prism of what do you have to do to take on Georgia? What do you have to do to take on Alabama? What do you have to do to take on Ohio State, right? I mean, those are the teams that you're targeting for. Mullen talks about the Gator standard all the time, and that standard is SEC championships. But even more than that, it's when you win the SEC that you are the prohibitive favorite to win the tournament. And that's what we're aiming for. And so there are markers, right? I mean, there are markers when you look at the teams that win the national championship and have gotten there consistently. There are markers that you need to take a look at. And I think that's really what we're doing is we're saying, hey, these are the things that in the past have been necessary. It doesn't mean they're always necessary. Certainly there are outliers, but I don't think you want to necessarily always be reliant on that. And so you look and say, okay, are we hitting this marker? Are we hitting this next marker? If we're not hitting that marker, what do we need to do in order to hit that marker in the future? And that's, just because you didn't necessarily bring in the class you wanted last year or 2 years ago doesn't mean you can't bring in the class you want next year. So what are you changing? What are you improving? And is it necessary, right? I mean, maybe these guys are better at evaluating people than anybody else who's out there, and we'll find that out. So if nothing else, it's an interesting argument, right? To have sort of, and I indicated this in the article that I wrote this week, that you've got the recruitniks who are sort of out there saying, there's no way that you're going to be able to win without having big time success on the recruiting trail. But then you've got other people who are worried that the negativity from the people who pay so much attention to recruiting is actually sort of a self-perpetuating cycle, right? That the negativity associated with a decommit or with somebody like Walker leaving then ends up impacting Mullen's ability to sell the program, moving forward from there too. And I think there is a little bit of truth to that, right? I mean, Gator Twitter is
it's a lightning rod.
It is aggressive. It is aggressive, right? And I mean, it depends on personalities. I mean, I think if you are a personality who thrives on the idea that you're going to be lauded when you do something well, I mean, no one's going to be louder and more in your corner than Gator Twitter if you go out there and show out as a recruit, a high level recruit who then goes out on the field and performs. But certainly guys who go out there and underperform or struggle are going to hear it as well. And that's just sort of the catch-22 with this particular program. It's one of the reasons why it's so fun to follow and so fun to cover.
Absolutely. So before we get into our kind of storylines of recruiting, let's take a quick look at where recruiting stands right now for the 2021 class, led by right now Ohio State, number one with 17 commits and an average of 95.33. Will, that is with 3 5 stars, 11 4 stars, and 3 3 stars. Let me say that again. 3 5 stars, 11 4 stars, and 3 3 stars there for Ohio State. And after a hot week up in Knoxville, Tennessee shoots up. I think they've had 7-8 commits in the last week or so. They shoot up to number 2 in the country right now with 18 commits, 2 5 stars, 4 4 stars, and 12 3-star for an average of 89.21. So it tells you the difference right there. While Tennessee may be number 2, and we'll get to it, North Carolina 3, Florida 4, you're looking at 3 teams there, Will, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Florida with an average right around, 90, 91. Ohio State with 17 commits, an average of 95.33. Clemson comes in at number 5 there with 9 commits and an average of 95.03. So tells you the difference there between the elites that we know coming into recruiting already with Ohio State, Alabama, Georgia, Clemson, of what the difference of the quality of the players that they're bringing in. But just the top 5 there shows you the disparity in that metric. But as I said, North Carolina comes in at number 3 with 14 commitments. Florida still at number 4, still a top 5 class right now with 12 commits there for the Gators. No 5 stars, 7 4 stars, and 5 3 stars to round out the top 10. Big surprise, Iowa in the 6th spot, Miami at number 7, USC at number 8, Minnesota at number 9, LSU at number 10. And this is, Will, the part where we can say, if you want to get if it gets on your nerves talking recruiting in May, the rankings are probably part of that. There's such a disparity in number of commits for these schools. Schools like Minnesota and Iowa are not going to end up in the top 10. Get off to some fast starts there, but Iowa right now, their average is at 88.04. Minnesota, 87.59. And that's LSU's at number 10 with an average of 93.61. So there you go. Just kind of lets the average right now, the average recruiting rankings probably mean a bit more than where you actually are ranked there. But Michigan 11, Notre Dame 12, Texas 13, Penn State 14, Maryland 15, Georgia all the way down to 17, but only 7 commits there. So you got schools like Alabama, Auburn that are right down the rankings, and that's just what you get when you look at recruiting in May. So that when you have side of the fan base that says I don't really care until National Signing Day. That's part of the reason why the rankings right now don't really mean a whole lot. They can lead up to things. And I think, getting commitments, sometimes I think the argument can be made it's easier to keep commitments than it is to, kind of rely on trying to go out there and flip guys who may decommit from other schools. But Will, just kind of a quick look at the rankings there show you why you can get in trouble a bit if you want to look at rankings in May.
Yeah, I mean, so I think you need the rankings you take with a grain of salt, right? The fact that Tennessee is second, they're not going to end up at second.
Yeah.
I think
they're not going to out-recruit Alabama. They're not going to out-recruit Georgia. They're probably not. I mean, they'll be maybe neck and neck with Florida because they were kind of close last year. But we know the usual suspects.
Well, and they haven't recruited Alabama thus far. Well, maybe Alabama because Alabama's like 40-something. But so the reason Tennessee has optimism is because they brought in 2 5-star guys in the last week, right?
Yep.
And if Florida had 2 5-star guys who just committed, we'd be very, very enthused about the direction of recruiting. And that's really what you're looking at when you look at Tennessee, because like you mentioned, their average player ranking is only 89.2. versus Florida that's at 90.7. Now, I will say North Carolina looks like they're sustainable under Mac Brown. Mm-hmm. And that's not, we talked, I put up an article today, Bill behind the scenes has been calling the ACC the almost competitive conference now for like 6 or 7 months when I've been talking to him. And North Carolina being able to build into the ACC along with Florida State if Norvell can get their act together. And then Clemson, it'll be nice to see Clemson have to play somebody during the year. And then you got Clemson with 9 commits, all 4 stars, right? So you look at 0 5 stars, 9 4 stars compared to Florida at 0 5 stars and 7 4 stars. You go, oh, those classes are pretty close to the same. Nah, Clemson's at 95.03. So they are bringing in top 100 guys. And you and I have talked about dividing it up into, 0 to 100, 101 to 200, 201 to 300, and how really getting guys in that top 100 category is really, really important, and Clemson's done that. Certainly Iowa, Miami, Minnesota, they're going to fall out. But LSU being at 93.6, that's a nice little national championship bump they've got there. USC's recruiting really well. Michigan, basically what it boils down to is that Florida's going to end up exactly where they wound up last year. They're going to end up 7th, 8th, 9th. Maybe they maybe they get a 5-star to commit like they did with Griffon Dexter. Maybe one of these guys that they evaluate who's sitting at, 60th, 70th, 80th right now, ends up as a 5-star because he's able to play his way into there after his senior year, assuming that football happens this this fall. But here's the deal, right? So Florida, Mullins brought in classes that have ranked 14th, 9th, and 9th in his first 3 seasons in Gainesville, according to 24/7 Sports. Their ratings, which are percentages, right, out of 100, are 90.75, 91.06, and 90.70. Those are the last 3 years. And this year, in early May, they're sitting here at 90.72. Last year, early May, they were 91.33. So, the quality of player that Florida has committed through May 1st is right around the quality of the player that Florida had committed through May 1st last year, and the quality of player that Florida had committed 2 years ago through May 1st, I'm sure as well. If you look back at that, it's just, the reality is that these schools, like you mentioned, like Tennessee's not going to finish above Alabama. Why do we know that? Because Alabama has a track record and Tennessee has a track record, and Mullins set a track record at Florida. This is what his recruiting is going to look like. And, we just sort of have to understand that's what's going to happen. Is it's going to be somewhere between 90.5 and 91.5, and he's either going to win with them or he's not. But that's where we're going to end up.
Yeah, I mean, the floor's definitely been raised. It's just the ceiling is about there with as far as elites go. You want the average to go up. Florida's going to have to start keeping those elite young guys in state and signing with the Gators instead of going out of state there. So, a lot of the storylines for recruiting this past week, class hurt most by decommitments lately in the storyline surrounding them. Kamara Wilcoxon had committed to Florida for a second time and then decommitted in late March for a second time. Then last week, he makes a surprise announcement, commits to Tennessee to get the ball rolling there for the Vols last week. Then another surprise comes late last Friday night in the form of Brashard Smith, the all-purpose athlete back from Palmetto, Miami Palmetto, decommitting from Florida. And you mentioned it in your article a little bit too. We'll get to more of your article a bit too. But, this doesn't necessarily hurt Florida in the form of losing a highly ranked player, but just hurt Florida more in the perception department there. Wilcoxon commits to Tennessee, and it looks like, a Florida staffer is tweeting about the situation, rubs some recruits the wrong way, and then a decommitment from Smith, who many thought certainly would stick in this Florida class. So, mainly the timing of it all really plays into the perception part of the story here for the Gators. Timing plays such a large part in all this, Will, in so many ways. Florida has 12 commits now. Had 3 of them come in the last couple of weeks, the angst of some of the fan base probably wouldn't be there. It's just, just the nature of the beast. That's how it goes. But since Florida got off to a fast start, that kind of was going to happen. I'll get into that in just a bit. And some will argue, it's quality of recruits, and that, is a valid argument, but, had Florida received a few of the 12 commits recently, I don't think we're having much of a conversation for a class that currently ranks 4th.
No, we would have heard people yelling 2 months ago when they didn't have anybody.
You're right, exactly.
Everybody.
Exactly.
I mean, that's the thing, right? I get why people get tired of hearing all the noise that's associated with recruiting, because 1, there's not really anything you can do about it. And 2, you don't really know where everything's going to fall until really, in December, but either December or February is where you kind of know where you're going to be at. And then you just sort of go from there, right? And a lot of people just watch the stuff so that they can enjoy the football game. And they're not necessarily, they want to know what happened on the field, but they're not real interested in the recruiting. But on the other side, you've got people who've gone and looked at it like we have and said, hey, the numbers make a difference and you have to bring in these guys. And, it's also you mentioned the staff tweeting and that sort of stuff. It's one of those things where you kind of want to feel like the staff is going to act like they've been there before and they've got all that stuff together and they're expecting this and they're building those relationships and they've got an idea of what's going on. And when you come off as vindictive, or when you do something that upsets the other recruits in terms of how you treat a kid, that's going to be something that sticks in people's minds, especially people who think you aren't doing a good enough job on the trail. And as far as Smith is concerned, we'll talk about that a little bit coming up soon, I'm sure. But the high school where he plays has a lot to do with the angst associated with his decommit. Not necessarily just him, though. Obviously, he's a good player, ranked 346th overall nationally. But I think the people that he plays with are also a big part of the angst that's tied in with him.
Yeah, and it's kind of getting to my point, Will. To me, some of this, and I tweeted this out, the brick wall, the momentum that's been stopped was kind of inevitable during the pandemic because of the fast start Florida got off to. Of course, it was going to slow down at some point. It's just heading into the beginning of the pandemic, Florida had 14 commits, was talk of college football recruiting out there for many of the services, especially after the junior day in early March, and then all the COVID stuff hits, and it seems like it just kind of thwarted the momentum the staff had. But maybe it was inevitable that something negative was going to happen. Got off to such a fast start, and of course, decommitments are going to happen. It happens in every cycle. Commitments would slow down and such, so it was going to happen. Florida wasn't going to have the majority of its class finished by the time summer rolled around. Recruiting just doesn't work that way. Florida wasn't going to have 20 commits by the time the summer rolled around. It was kind of nature of the beast here. So don't get me wrong. It stinks seeing some of the targets we thought Florida have a good shot with go commit somewhere else, and decommits paired with that. But that's recruiting for you. Ups and the downs, as we mentioned earlier, and to kind of further the staff thought here. Whatever the staff has done to adjust the situation that we're currently in doesn't seem to have paid off. Two things can be true at the same time. Maybe a momentum drop was inevitable, but whatever this, but what was the strategy from the staff during this pandemic? We've seen schools take so much advantage of this, and we'll see if that pays off in the long run. Who knows? These players out there aren't taking visits. How solid are these commitments? We'll see. But we would certainly like to see Florida getting a couple at this time. And Florida is just now starting virtual visit tours this week for prospects. This is something other schools have been doing for weeks. Something I mentioned a few weeks ago on the podcast in regards to Zach Evans, since his visit plans are up in the air. So Will, while maybe some of the slowdown was to be expected, there are still things we can point to that could be done better.
Well, I mean, I think that's true of every program, right? I'm not here to be a defender of the Florida program, but I think every program can take a look and say, hey, how can we do this better? I think the problem is you're starting to run out of excuses, right? The excuse 2-3 years ago was, well, let's just show them on the field. And Florida's gone 10-3, 11-2, finished in the top 10 2 straight years, has looked to be headed in the right direction. The offense is functional. The defense is very, very good as well. And Florida has been an excellent team on the field in the biggest conference in the world. And it's not translating on the recruiting side, right? And same general thing here where you're talking about stuff that other programs have been doing for weeks, and Florida's momentum slows down, and it's like, okay, well, you can mimic what other programs are doing. That it's okay. So I think at the end of the day, we've talked about this, just every year, is that salesmen sell, right? Recruiters recruit, and that doesn't appear to be the MO for this program. Unfortunately, I mean, Mullen is his staff has been so effective at getting the guys ready to play, other than the wristband thing with Georgia last year. Other than that, they have always been prepared. They have always been ready to go, and they've always put forth a great effort on the field, and he's done more with less than I think anybody in the country, really, except for maybe some mid-major guys might be able to make a distinction or might be able to make a claim there. But the problem is this is the one area that if it improves, he's going to win championships. And so you would think that there would be an extraordinary emphasis on how do we do this better? Who do we bring in to do this better? What can we change to do this better? And like you said, there has been a delay in terms of being able to deal with the things that are going on right now. Now, obviously, no one really foresees a pandemic going on. And so this is sort of uncharted water for everybody. But the ability to make changes on the roll when you see things that aren't necessarily going your way, you hope they'll be able to make those adjustments and be able to bring some of these guys back into the fold and potentially bring in some of the guys we're going to talk about.
Yeah, Will, and part of that's where I fall. And I tweeted this too over the weekend, and I got a pretty good response. And it is with the caveat that we have to see where this class finishes. But a lot of the angst from the fan base comes with just how close, as you just mentioned, how close Florida is right now. They just have to get over the hump. And not to say the way recruiting is going now that they can't, but, right now they're a top 10 team based on what Mullen has done in his first 2 seasons, with recruiting classes left by Jim McElwain that weren't even in the top 10. So the question becomes, is a top 10, top 15 classes enough? Does Mullen need elite classes? And the angst comes from elite classes makes it pretty much a foregone conclusion that he's such a good coach that he's going to win championships. You get this man a top 5 class, and Florida's going to go out there and win an SEC title. Florida's going to go out there and compete for the college football playoff. And look, they're just a hair step below right now with these programs. You see it in the final rankings and how close they've been to Georgia in the final rankings and how they've played similar opponents in there. And there are things you can point to show how close Florida is. But and you're like, oh, you just had these couple more players, these highly elite players. That can be the difference with Dan Mullen. A more for sure thing. Imagine this guy with the Tim Tebow and the Percy Harvin types, and that's what we want to see. And look, on a consistent basis, he's not going to out-recruit Saban, Smart, Dabo. It's just not going to happen with the way things stand right now. Recruiting has gotten better since Jim McElwain. He's hit the transfer portal hard. That part of it has helped so much. But and I've likened it this, and I said it many times, just like the NFL. You hear the whole saying, you build your team through the draft, and and I think that for the most part is true in college football too. Is you build your team through recruiting.
Absolutely, and I think so. I guess the reality is that Florida has lost to Georgia 3 straight years and has lost 2 straight years to Georgia under Dan Mullen. And then you look at the difference in the talent between the two teams, and it doesn't even really seem fair. So if you look at 2016 to 2020, Florida has 1 5-star, 66 4-stars, 48 3-stars. Georgia has 22 5-stars, 73 4-stars, and 28 3-stars. So yes, Georgia's seen some attrition. They've seen some guys transfer out. Yes, Florida has brought in guys through the transfer portal who are 5-star rated or highly rated 4-stars. But the talent gap is enormous, and the reality is,
Florida's also had their own attrition and stuff. Basically, what we just got through talking about.
Well, so yes, but even if all those guys were there, you would still say, hey, this is an issue that they're that far behind, and it would, if Florida was 1-1 against Georgia over the last 2 years and 1-1 against LSU and had dropped the game against Missouri or something like that, you'd say, okay, talent isn't the only thing that's at play here. But the reality is they got boat raced by Georgia 2 years ago. Last year, you can go back and watch that game. It was not a 7-point game. Georgia was in control the entire time. And, we can argue about whether it's 7 points or not. But at the end of the day, did I feel like Florida really had an opportunity to win that game? I really didn't. I felt like Georgia controlled it. And considering how bad Georgia played throughout the year on both sides of that game, makes me a little bit more pessimistic coming out of it, just because they were able to convert all those 3rd downs and for a team that was struggling coming in and then struggled going out, to have Florida be the one game where they weren't struggling or where they didn't look like they were struggling is a little bit disturbing as well. So, recruiting's a huge part of it, obviously. And, I'm glad Georgia doesn't have Justin Fields. I guess that's sort of the positive. But they've got Van de Graaff, I think, coming in next year. He's a top 12 level quarterback, top 12 nationally ranked recruit coming in. So it's not stopping. So you either are going to beat them with the guys you got, or you're going to bring in higher level guys and you're going to beat them with those guys. And it looks like that we're going to have to beat them with the guys that we got. And that's fine. It'll be fun. I mean, we're going to get to watch it. And certainly I think you got to give Mullen all the credit in the world if he's able to pull it off. But I think an apropos example is Auburn under Gus Malzahn, right? I mean, Malzahn gets Alabama, maybe 1 out of every 3 years. Mm-hmm. And he's able to do that in some respects because he's had very, very good quarterback play. So 1 year he had Jarrett Stidham, 1 year he had Cam Newton, or I guess Newton was back with Chiswick. But regardless, they've got.
Yeah, he was the OC, so you can. Yeah.
And then they had Nick Marshall there 1 year too when they got him. So they've had guys who have been able to put up numbers that has been better than what Alabama's quarterback's been able to put up, and they've been able to beat them, but they don't beat them consistently. No one thinks that Auburn is at the same level as Alabama. Now, granted, Alabama is one of the greatest programs we've ever seen, so it's a little bit unfair to compare anybody to them. But at the same time, that's what you're looking at right now based on the level of recruiting and where Georgia is 1 out of every 3 years. Florida hopefully is going to be able to get them, and fans are going to have to decide for themselves whether that's good enough for them, right? That you'll hear people barking about how recruiting doesn't matter if Florida wins this year. It doesn't mean it doesn't matter. It just means that you got them the 1 out of 3 years. So let's start looking out 3 years from now. If Mullins won, 4 out of 6 3 years from now, then all right, I'm going to have to eat some crow. But if we're looking at 2 out of 6, then that's recruiting in my mind.
All right, then one part of this too, Will, as far as looking at recruiting storylines, is that I don't think we've really had the chance for looking at Florida to feel the Tim Brewster effect. Come in with fire and locked up his position with Justin Wilcox and Nick Elsness, and look primed to go help recruit other positions until the pandemic hit. And that's Brewster's forte, in-person recruiting, and he doesn't get to do that right now. And I know some out there are harping on him not helping as much as they thought initially, but he's a strong in-person and relationship guy, and that's getting hit right now, that type of interaction. Yes, I know other schools, as we mentioned, are taking advantage at this time, but I do think that it's hitting new staff additions and new coaches a little harder. So to me, Brewster's track record is too strong for me to worry about that part of it right now. And then seeing people joke out there that everybody else around the staff is bringing Brewster down and all that stuff. I hope that's more of a joke there. I think we have to let things play out a bit more before we're going to go that far with it. But I do think that this type of recruiting, this situation that we're in, kind of negates what Brewster's so well known for.
Yeah, I think Brewster's going to be fine, and I think the staff is. I think Florida is making changes that are necessary to get to where they need to get to. Question you can ask is, are they doing it fast enough, and are they doing it in an organized enough fashion? But I think Brewster has a track record. But again, you look at where North Carolina is, and is it Brewster or is it Mac Brown? And then you look at where Texas A&M is, and you say, was it Brewster there or was it Jimbo Fisher? And I think that's a legitimate question to ask. But I think for the most part, everybody understands that Brewster's a big-time guy when it comes to recruiting. But the tight ends coach isn't the guy who's going to drive your recruiting. I mean, nobody looks at. I mean, I guess maybe a few Florida fans look at the guy who went from Georgia to Arkansas. I don't even know his name, but who's the head coach in Arkansas now, and say, oh well, he would. That's going to drag down Georgia's offensive line recruiting. I think at the end of the day, the buck stops at Kirby Smart and the buck stops at Dan Mullen. Those are the people we need to look at, and whether things get done or don't get done, it won't be Brewster's fault, and it won't be the offensive line coach for Georgia either. It'll be Kirby Smart and Dan Mullen.
Well, and some fans were already feeling this before the Isiah Walker news. And we alluded to it just a bit earlier too, but it's, go back to a year ago and, here we go again. And the negative thing. I didn't like that comparison before the Walker stuff because, this was recruiting and the stuff that happened a year ago was so much different, so much off the field stuff. That was so much different, so in a different stratosphere. And now we're getting a little bit of taste of that again. But I still think a little bit of positive can be taken about that. And you go back to a year ago and maybe how, like I said, it was a little overblown in regards to recruiting. Spring football had happened. Jalen Jones has to leave program. Chris Steele saga happened. The buzz about Florida's off-field issues gets out there, and in turn, some players for 2019 didn't qualify either, as well. There's a whole litany of issues about this time a year ago. Many out there, so many publications, many projected doom and gloom for the program at that point. There's no way Florida can handle all this offseason, off the field issues and go have a good season. Some decommitments happen after all this stuff, but nothing really came out of all that. Florida goes on to win 11 games, finishes with what was at the time a top 10 2020 class anyway. That's taking some hits too now with Isiah Walker, but that stuff blew over, and the current situation, to me, still, yes, today with Isiah Walker, you can compare it a bit more, but before that point, you really couldn't when you were just looking at the recruiting side of it. And what we're seeing right now, to me, still on the recruiting side of things, more of a natural ebb and flow to recruiting, especially compared to what Florida was able to rebound from last year around this time and go win 11 games. And it's definitely getting noticed, Will, and even by some of Florida's current recruits, of course, and current commits. Carlos Del Rio, the current quarterback commit for the Gators, felt the need to tweet out this when everything going around "I fellas," or quote, "I fellas, let's stay focused. Grass ain't always greener on the other side. I see a lot of you boys wavering and looking around, letting those coaches from other schools sell you on a dream. We know what Florida is going as Florida is. We know what Florida is going to do. We're going to win regardless. But everybody, do what's best for you. Hashtag stay focused." So we'll, of course. And if you're on Twitter, you're going to notice it. If you're a Florida fan, you're going to notice it. If you're a Florida commit, you're going to notice it. If you're a Florida player, you're going to notice it. And we certainly see it there with Florida's current 2021 quarterback feeling the need to go out there and kind of, clear some air.
Yeah, I mean, so I think there's two things there. One is that we haven't seen it transfer to the field yet. And that's really what we're talking about, right? The 2019 class really made an impact last year, obviously, with guys like Elam and Bogle and Zipper a little bit. Diabate was out there, Ethan White. So there were guys from that class who were out there and played well and contributed. But what it's one of those, can you prove a negative? Wouldn't it be great to have Chris Steele and Kyrie Elam on the outside this year? What about R.J. Henderson at wide receiver, DeJuan Black at linebacker, Davey Hammond there on the offensive line to sort of offset Isiah Walker, leaving here? You got Jalen Jones, so you don't have somebody in the quarterback room competing. Obviously, though, I think, deservedly so, but at the same time, he's not there. You got Wardrick Wilson, who had the visa issues, and then even the year before, you've got Lucas Kroll that they brought in as a transfer, or that they brought in as a junior college guy. He's now transferred. Got Malik Langham. He transferred. Justin Watkins kicked off for disciplinary reasons. You can't really blame them for Randy Russell or Noah Banks, who had some health issues. But then you got John Huggins and then Chris Blake, who left last year after one game. And then you got David Reese, who injured his Achilles. So just in general, the attrition from the 18 and the 19 classes has been pretty significant. You always expect some attrition from that first sort of transfer or the transition class that comes in. So it's not really a surprise that we're seeing that from 2018. Where it's a surprise is that you see it in 2019 and that you're starting to see it in 2020 as well. And, at some point, we all remember those seasons where Florida just got injured all over the place and everything started to fall apart. And there was one Muschamp year where, we're down to Skylar Morenweg at quarterback, and, you don't have an offensive line out there because nobody's healthy. And there was that year right after when McElwain took over where they didn't have enough offensive linemen to run the spring game. I mean, that kind of depth at some point, especially in an SEC season, comes back and bites you. And that's really what they're missing, is the key depth pieces. Now, those guys from those classes are going to have to start stepping in now too. Jacob Copeland is going to have to step in now and be a big part of things, because the wide receivers that they had last year are all gone. They're going to have some of these offensive linemen step in. Diabate, guys like Tyron Hopper, Bogle, those guys are going to have to step up and be big contributors on the defensive line. And, are they going to be able to? And if they get injured, is there somebody behind them? That's really the question. I mean, if Georgia's replacing, I think, 9 of their 11 guys on offense, and I think they're going to be just fine. I mean, I think they may struggle a little bit because, Jamie Newman maybe struggles a little bit, especially early on, but at the same time, Georgia's not going to be losing a game to Kentucky or anything like that. I think it's going to – Georgia and Florida are the two teams that are high level in the East, and they're going to be battling it out. So if somebody comes in and gets injured on Georgia, it's just the next guy up. Does Florida have that next guy up, I think is really the question. And then, just the general angst. I mean, geez, when your quarterback recruit is starting to hear the angst and starting, I mean, it wasn't like he was addressing the fan base. He was addressing the guys in the class. Right. And, when you're starting to address the guys in the class publicly on Twitter, I'd be nervous too if I was a fan looking at that. It's sort of the same thing I said earlier. Within the Florida framework, you can say, hey, there's an excuse for this, there's an excuse for that. But if it was Tennessee, Georgia, or LSU or Florida State or Miami, we'd be sitting there going, geez, what's going on down there? Mm-hmm. It's sort of the same general thing, right? I mean, and at some point, the excuses don't matter anymore. The question is, did you bring the recruit? Did the recruit stay? Did he go on the field, and did he perform? And when Mullen has gotten guys to campus who are high level and has gotten them on the field, they have performed. And that's, I think, maybe where the disconnect is that if we can get these guys out there and get them on the field, they're going to perform and Florida's going to win. And it's not like Florida's going to go 4-8 or anything like that. But the reality is 0-3 for Mullen against Georgia. That's going to be problematic. And all of a sudden you're staring at sort of that being the albatross, and Georgia having their entire offense come back in 2021, and that's just not a situation you want to be in. So, it's not ideal. It's not ideal. But you got to deal with the cards that you've been dealt. You got to deal with the things that you earned, and we'll see whether Mullen's able to overcome it.
Yep, well, and I think another side of this too, in looking at recruiting, and this is kind of more of a general, not necessarily this class coming up, and kind of going to relate to your article a bit too, and getting guys that fit his system. He's won 21 games with mostly McElwain guys, and look, I know Mullen thinks he can win with whoever he rolls out there and have success with McElwain's players. So maybe the next step in winning titles in his mind is getting his players and Will, hitting on your latest article over at Read and Reaction, maybe getting his own quarterback in. I don't think many of us saw this coming, but going into year 3 of Mullen's tenure, here we are going into the season with Kyle Trask starting and not a quarterback Mullen recruited. I don't think any of us would have predicted that in 2018 when Mullen was hired. I don't really. It was a year, maybe 2 years of Felipe Franks and Emory Jones takes over. That was pretty much the foregone conclusion when Dan Mullen was hired and Emory Jones was his quarterback recruit. So look, and this is not right here. I want to stop it right now. This is not meant to start a quarterback debate here. This is more of a look where eventually Mullen can make a difference. If classes aren't consistently going to rank in the top 5, he's going to have to get great to elite quarterback play. And that's kind of what you outlined in your latest article at Read and Reaction.
Yeah, so what I did was I went back and looked at Clemson, because they're usually the team that everybody looks at and says, well, this is what Florida just needs to build like Clemson. Clemson didn't recruit really well to start with. And then I looked at Michigan, which is what I think nobody in Florida wants to be, right? Nobody wants to be just getting drummed by Ohio State, or in Florida's case, Georgia, every year, and struggling to get, and building up your hope every year, thinking this is going to be the year, and then not being able to get over the hump. But it's really interesting when you look back. So Dabo Swinney, when he took over from 2010 to 2015, Clemson had an average national ranking of 16.2. And Michigan, since Harbaugh took over in 2015, from 2015 to 2020, has had an average national recruiting ranking of 15.7. And if you look at conferences, Clemson, it was 2.8, and Michigan, it was 2.5. And then you look at their main rivals. So Florida State, their average national ranking was 5.3, and Ohio State's has been 5.7. So really, when you think about it, Clemson was the second dog in the ACC compared to Florida State, and Michigan is the second dog in the recruiting race against Ohio State. And Clemson has been able to beat Florida State and really been able to become the top dog in the ACC. And from 2010 to 2005, though, Florida State won 4 of the 6 battles, right? But when you look at the reason that Clemson was able to win a couple of those battles, one was Taj Boyd, and the other one was Deshaun Watson. That was the starting quarterback for both of the games that they won from 2010 to 2005 or 2015. When they brought Kyle Parker in the game to play in 2010, even though Florida State only had Christian Ponder at quarterback, Florida State was able to win, and able to win handily. And then when Florida State had a quarterback who was elite, like Jameis Winston, the year he won the Heisman in 2013, then even with Taj Boyd at quarterback, Clemson couldn't necessarily compete. But when you look at Michigan, guys like Shea Patterson, John O'Korn, Wilton Spate, and Jake Rudock, compared to Justin Fields, Dwayne Haskins, J.T. Barrett, and Cardale Jones, Ohio State's had the better quarterback each time, and they're 5-0 from 15 to 19. And it started out, Cardale Jones that year in 2015 against Michigan. Obviously, he was a little bit young at that point because Barrett had been playing and then got injured. But and that was maybe the closest game that they played. And then the next year, I think it was a 3-point game with Spate and then Barrett coming back. And from then, it's just been Ohio State big each of those years. So really, I think what it boils down to is that the quarterback, if he's elite, is able to close the talent gap that you have of, maybe 10 or 11 spots. And that's important because Georgia has averaged, basically almost 1. I think they're like 1.4 or something over the last 5 or 6 years, and Florida's been at 10.8. So you've got that same sort of general spread. They're going to need the elite quarterback play to be able to compete. And like you said, we wouldn't have imagined that the third year coming in that we wouldn't be seeing Emory Jones, that Kyle Trask would be the starter and the pretty solid starter, I think. But, at the same time, they're going to need elite quarterback play. I don't know that good quarterback play is enough. And that's really sort of been the question all offseason is, and that is why there's a debate between Florida fans in terms of who should be quarterback. Not because they don't think that Kyle Trask is good. It's because they feel intuitively, I think, that there needs to be somebody transcendent at quarterback to be able to beat the juggernaut up in Athens from to be able to close that talent gap. And, Emory Jones hasn't had an opportunity to show us yet, but the fact that he hasn't had an opportunity to show us means he could show us. And that's why that's even a question, right? Because otherwise it'd be you plug in the guy who's solid. I think I sort of think of Trask as like an AJ McCarron at Alabama, right? Like, McCarron was never flashy. He threw the ball in the right spot. He actually had a couple of really good years there at Alabama. But the year they beat LSU in the championship, really the LSU game was when he really started to show out. And then the next year he was much, much better. You hope that sort of thing happens with Trask, but at the same time, people were a lot more excited in Alabama with Tua at quarterback than they were with AJ McCarron. And that's, the backup quarterback's always the most popular guy, but he's the most popular guy, especially when you think you need a transcendent performance from him to really win the SEC. And that's where the debate's coming in.
All right, there, Wilson. And that got me thinking and a little bit. Not only are we looking at a Dan Mullen quarterback not taking over in year 3, but how much of McElwain players are still looking to be a projected starter in year 3 for Dan Mullen? So I'm taking this. If Florida lined up and played a game today, this is where I think the starting lineup would kind of go. So if you start at quarterback, Trask, that's a McElwain guy. Running back, Damian Pierce. There's your Mullen guy there. Wide receiver, Grimes, Copeland. There's your Mullen guys there. Kadarius Toney is that third wide receiver spot. Jim McElwain recruit. Kyle Pitts, Dan Mullen there. So you go to the offensive line, Stone Forsyth, McElwain guy there. And going from left to right here, how I think the offensive line. Forsyth, McElwain guy, Richard Garage. There you go. Dan Mullen, Brett Heggie. You go back to Jim McElwain there. Ethan White, I think, there at right guard. And I'm still putting Gene Lance there at the right tackle, much to fan chagrin there. But just kind of think that's the way it plays out right now, especially with the latest news and Isiah Walker there. So only 4 out of the 11 projected starters are from the McElwain era, Will. So, with transfers and the recent wide receiver departures, no surprise to see many of Mullen guys taking over on the offensive side of the ball and kind of his offensive side of the ball, or his side of the ball as well, but still kind of the surprise that in year 3 it's not his quarterback.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when you go and look back at the 2007 Florida team,
yep,
right, it's not really that, guys like Andre Caldwell, guys like Keyston Moore, Lewis Murphy, Cornelius Ingram, those are guys who are all brought in under the Ron Zook umbrella, right? The difference is that the best guys on the offense were Tim Tebow and Percy Harvin.
Yep.
Those are the guys who got brought in by Urban Meyer and really made the difference between them being a 10-win team. I mean, think about it, right? If they'd have had sort of a game managing quarterback and they didn't have Percy Harvin, does that 2008 team win the national championship? Does the 2006 team win the national championship? I think the specialness of those guys is what pushed them over the hump. And so when you look at the 2020 team for Florida, who are those guys, right? Who are the guys from the 2019 class who are going to come in on the offensive side of the ball? And this is maybe where the focus on the defensive side of the ball the last couple of years starts to become an issue. I mean, they really need somebody like Jamarcus Weston or Trent Whittemore or somebody like that to really step up and be a difference maker. And the question is, are they going to be able to do that? So hopefully somebody like Xavier Henderson or Pitts maybe can be the guy who really steps in. I mean, he's obviously a Mullen recruit. And so, if Pitts can step up and be sort of that real huge difference maker, Damian Pierce has an opportunity to be a difference maker, like you already mentioned Grimes. That's going to be the question, is when we look back at 2020, is there a guy on the offensive side of the ball who's a Mullen recruit who took the offense from being adequate or good to great? Because that's what you see when you look back at those 5 stars who came in. under Urban Meyer and really showed out. And we don't have the 5-star pedigree coming into Florida, or maybe we do, right? If you get Lingard and Shorter, who end up being that difference maker if they're allowed to play this year, then maybe that we'll look back and say, hey, those transfers were the key because those guys were contributing to the 2020 team in a way that Tebow and Harvin were contributing to that 2007 team.
Yeah, and mentioning 2007, Will, and kind of the big difference here is on the defensive side of the ball. You go back to 2007, you were replacing so many of Ron Zook's guys. I was completely surprised about how many McElwain guys are projected stars on the defense. I'm going to start on the back end first. Sean Davis, McElwain guy. Brad Stewart, McElwain guy. Star, Amari Burney. There's your first Dan Mullen guy. Outside cornerback, Marco Wilson, McElwain guy. Other side, Elam. There's your Mullen guy. Linebacker, both McElwain guys more than likely, right? If Florida was to play a game right now, Ventrell Miller, James Houston, both of Mac guys, I think would be at linebacker right now. You go to Buck, Brenton Cox, I'll slide him in there right now. You could go Jeremiah Moon there too. If Florida was to play a game right now and he was healthy, that would be a McElwain guy, but I'll go Brenton Cox just for the sake of this argument. Go to the defensive line. And this is where, another big difference. Zach Carter, McElwain guy. Kyrene Campbell, McElwain. Slayton, McElwain. 8 of the projected starters there I just gave you were Jim McElwain recruits there. So now we know we'll see plenty of Mullen and Grantham recruits on that side of the field in the form of Diabate, Chatfield, Dexter, Kimbrough, Hill, Dean. But, there's still Donovan Steiner, Jeremiah Moon that were actually recruited by McElwain. Those guys will get major minutes in year 3 of Mullen regime. So I didn't really think about it until this exercise. Well, I was a bit surprised to see still so many of Jim McElwain's guys on the defensive side of the ball, a side of the ball that has been loaded up recently in recruiting under Todd Grantham the last couple of years.
Yeah, it's interesting when you go back and look at that 2007 team. And granted, they struggled to stop people, but one of the reasons they struggled to stop people is they were so young.
Yeah.
Brandon Spikes is the leader in tackles, 16 tackles for loss. Jermaine Cunningham, Major Wright, Joe Hayden,
yep.
Dustin Doe. So there were a lot of guys who'd been brought in by Meyer and by Mullen in some capacity, but by that staff who were contributing in that 2007 year and then contributed very, very, very heavily to the 2008 championship. And I think that maybe is the thing where, again, who's going to step up, right? So 2007, Brandon Spikes is clearly the leader on the defense. Joe Hayden is clearly a cornerback who's necessary for them to take the next step in 2008. Those guys were out there on the field and they learned and had some hard lessons while they were out there on the field, but they learned and they showed out. And that's going to be the question that I have for this year is who of those guys that you mentioned, guys like Elam and Bogle and Hopper and Diabate and Summerall and Jalen Humphreys and all those guys, are there going to be guys who jump off the screen when they go out there? And you mentioned the McElwain guys at linebacker. Well, linebacker's obviously been a little bit of at least when it comes to coverage, linebacker has been a struggle. There was a reason Amari Burney was sliding up into linebacker last year. Is he going to slide up to linebacker even more? And is he going to be one of the starting linebackers? Right. Tyron Hopper, somebody who was a top 100 recruit and redshirted last year. Is he going to be able to step in and take away the job from a guy who, these guys who have 3 or 4 years of experience, will at some point athleticism, if it starts to take over, are those guys athletic enough to be able to take their jobs or at least push the guys who are in that position to be even better? Those are the questions that we're going to have to ask. And that's one of the reasons why you want recruiting depth, right? Is that you have that sort of competition in the room and everybody's pushing everybody else to get better.
Yeah, I'm having a hard time deciding whether I think that's a good thing, having so many McElwain guys in there. There's a lot of experience there and guys who have made plays, a lot of inconsistency there at the same time. Sean Davis, especially in the secondary, Sean Davis, Brad Stewart, those guys. At defensive front, I still feel pretty good about those guys, especially with the way Slayton came on at the end of last year. But man, I didn't expect it till I started listing off guys. I was like, wow, there's so many more McElwain guys than I expected. If you would have told me 3 years ago or when Dan Mullen was hired, if we would have seen that many guys, I don't know if I would have believed you there. But, kind of a catch-22. Do you go with a lot of the experience or do you go with a lot of the young guys here? And because I think from what we've seen the last couple of years, the Mullen guys that I mentioned like Diabate, Chatfield, Dexter, Kimbrough, Hill, Dean, probably have the higher ceiling there. But, what will we see out of those guys with so many of McElwain guys still left over?
Yeah, it's interesting. When you look at the 2006 team for Florida, you had guys like Earl Everett, Brandon Seiler, Tony Joyner, Jarvis Moss, Ryan Smith, Reggie Nelson, Ray McDonald, Derek Harvey. Those are the guys who were really the big, the heavy hitters on defense. And those guys, many of them rightfully so, went to the NFL after that 2006 year. And other than CJ Henderson, nobody went to the NFL this year from Florida's defense. So when you say you don't know what to expect, I think that's I'm assuming that's what you mean, is that there aren't a lot of guys from this team who you look at and go, there's a first round pick. There's a first round pick. There's a third round pick.
Right. I listed so many McElwain guys, but is that a good thing?
Well, and so I think it's interesting though, because the 2007 defense couldn't stop anybody.
Right.
We all remember that Citrus Bowl against Michigan, where Tebow would drive him right down the field, and then here comes Michigan straight back the other direction. You're like, God, just like one stop, guys, one stop. It was sort of like the LSU game from last year, and Florida's schedule's so easy this year. And they really only have to, and LSU's lost their quarterback, Georgia's lost their quarterback. So it's a really weird situation, because I don't think this is an ideal setup for Florida from the standpoint of having all those guys from the McElwain era. At the same time, if it was only people from the Mullen era, we'd be sitting here saying they're too young. They're not going to be able to take advantage of where they are in the schedule. And then obviously the transfers that Mullen's brought in, Cox in particular, sort of buoys this third year where most coaches take a dip. So it's going to be kind of fascinating to see what happens. But we both know that eventually the Mullen guys are going to get in there just because of injuries, right? I mean, at some point you're going to have 2 or 3 injuries on defense, and then you're going to have guys who are able to step in, and certainly we got to hope then that they've got the experience and the talent to be able to do that and do that well.
Yeah. And a lot of it's just circumstantial, especially for the offensive side. Just lost a litany of receivers there. Of course, you're going to have to replace them with Mullen guys. That's just, it was just, the cycle of the way it happened there. Quarterback still the kind of one position we're maybe surprised at. Running back, maybe Malik Davis, but we'll see. Appears to me is the guy going in. So taking a look at both sides of the ball, I still kind of find it surprising. So many McElwain guys on the defense and so many Mullen guys on the offense there. So right before we get off here, while it is May, we can take a look ahead in the world of recruiting, and 2 commitments happening soon. To keep a close eye on for the Gators, and both that can somewhat lessen the blow of losing Brashard Smith late last week. Charles Montgomery commits on May 24th between Florida and Maryland. He announced on Twitter this past week. A few 24/7 sports crystal balls have come in for the Gators recently there. So Montgomery is is a 24/7 sports composite 4-star prospect out of Armwood, ranks as the 239th ranked player in the country, has played running back and slot wide receiver in high school. So definitely a versatile tool if Mullen can get him in his offense. And also highly ranked 4-star wide receiver Christian Leary will also be making a commitment June 6th, where it looks like Florida, Oklahoma, Alabama, and Auburn seem to be the top choices. 152nd ranked player in the country out of Orlando, says no matter where he commits, he's going to take all of his visits when everything opens back up. So, Will, this is a wide receiver that's a threat to score whenever he touches the ball, and Mullen has specifically targeted him himself for his offense, and is a big player here in the recruitment of Leary. So, Will, in a month from now, if Florida's going if Florida was to get one or both of those guys, then perhaps Gator Nation will feel better. And there's also a chance Florida gets neither and panic ensues again, but with some of the fan base. But 2 guys there that can kind of change fortunes, kind of change the way maybe people are viewing Florida in the next month or so.
It's interesting. These guys aren't the typical guys that you sort of think of when you think of who Mullen goes after. So Charles Montgomery's 5'10", 185. You mentioned he's sort of a running back, wide receiver, slot receiver hybrid. Christian Leary, 5'9", 180. Both highly ranked guys. So Montgomery's 239th overall. Leary's 152nd overall. So both 5-star guys, or I'm sorry, 4-star guys. But interesting that they're smaller. So you think of them more as like a Kadarius Toney maybe replacement, or even in the mold of a guy like Jeff Demps or a guy like Chris Rainey, and their sort of contribution to the offense, or maybe even a guy like Brandon James, right? That somebody who can return kicks with a little bit more explosion than we saw from what Freddie Swain last year. But yeah, certainly. I mean, anytime you can get guys who are 4-stars, high level 4-stars, so 152, pretty high up there for Leary. It certainly lessens the blow. I mean, again, you look at Brashard Smith, he was an all-purpose back, sort of that running back, wide receiver type of hybrid that you're talking about with Montgomery, and 3-star, 346th. I think for Smith, if he was somebody who got pushed out because you got Montgomery, I don't think any Florida fan would have a problem with it, at least based on rankings. But certainly somebody who's deciding between Florida and Maryland. I mean, it's not like he's deciding between Florida and Alabama. He's not deciding between Florida and Georgia. He's deciding between Florida and Maryland. Florida needs to win that battle.
Absolutely. Hopefully it's not another Stephon Diggs turnout there. So, and keeping up with here before we get off here, if you want to see Florida take that major leap here recruiting, and this is it. But you may have to wait till National Signing Day. 2 big targets have announced they're going to wait and announce then, and they come from the Miami Palmetto area school. 5-star cornerback Jason Marshall, who seems like a Florida lean right now, lists Florida as a finalist with Clemson and Alabama. We're going to have to wait there. And highly ranked safety and the 59th ranked player Corey Collier announced on Twitter, they're not committing to National Signing Day there. So 2 big-time targets we're just going to have to wait on. But the reason I bring those 2 guys up, Will, first of all, they are major Gator targets. But, so much of this class, ultimately for me, is going to be judged on what happens at Miami Palmetto and their players. Florida is on so many of those guys, and those guys are highly ranked prospects the staff is after. Brashard Smith may have just decommitted, but still lists Florida as a leader. Staff likes him and his style of play. 5-star defensive tackle Leonard Taylor is high on the Gators, but no decision coming soon there. 4-star defensive tackle Savion Collins currently committed to Miami. He's listening, very high on the Gators. Florida's got to get his mom on board if Florida wants to flip him. And hopefully, like the Lakeland trio a couple years ago and that class under Urban Meyer years ago, the Gators strike big at one particular school.
Yeah, well, that's what I was about to say, is that this sort of reeks of the Lakeland trio from 2019 and those 3 guys coming, and you sort of looked at that and said, hey, this is sort of the turning point where Florida has an opportunity to really announce their authority. But I do wonder whether all 5 of these guys, because Brashard Smith is sort of in that list of the guys who are coming from Miami Palmetto, I do wonder whether those 5 guys want to play together. I mean, certainly, Marshall is a 5-star cornerback. Then you got Collier, who's a 4-star safety. And then Leonard Taylor and Savion Collins are both, one's a 5-star, one's a 4-star defensive tackle. You've pretty much filled out your entire defense if you can get those guys to come. So certainly it's an important place for Florida to be able to focus, and particularly with the issues that are going down at the University of Miami, you would expect Florida to be able to get more inroads down there. And considering the issues that Florida is dealing with in terms of Alabama, Georgia, and Clemson coming down into the state, then driving down further south may be a way that they can sort of recoup some of those losses maybe a little bit. So yeah, I mean, it's going to be important. I think at the end of the day, these are the guys you think of who are sort of leading the pack. But again, I think if we look back at the last couple of recruiting classes, one thing that we sort of recognize or need to recognize is that there are names that are going to pop up and opportunities are going to pop up for different guys who aren't necessarily on the radar today, either because, we were waiting for grades, or the staff, was able to see that there was interest, or, somebody decommits from a different program, and all of a sudden now he's available to be able to flip to Florida. So those names are going to pop up. I don't want to put all of our eggs in the Miami Palmetto basket, but that, I think, along with just general malaise when it comes to recruiting and sort of saying, here it goes again, that's one of the reasons why the Brashard Smith decommitment sort of hits people harder, is because there's a recognition that there's all those other guys at Miami Palmetto. And if you're struggling to bring Smith in, what does that say about the other 4 guys that you're going to try to bring in as well?
Well, hopefully he just wanted to decommit and recommit with all those guys. Will. So,
Hey, that's what it'll be, man.
or most of them. Florida's not going to go 5 for 5. I mean, if they do, I'll eat crow. But there's no, go 5 for 5 there, man. I tell you what, that'd be something. But Florida's got to get Jason Marshall. They're in really good shape for. Get him 5-star cornerback. Add to that legacy there at that position for the Gators. But of course, hopefully, can hit on more from that school there. So we'll kind of went long here a little bit. What you got coming up for read and reaction?
Oh, well, I mean, we'll see where this recruiting stuff goes. I have to revisit it depending upon what's going on. But, this is the time of year when you really start looking at film usually and trying to decide what's important to look for, what people should be looking for, after the spring game. And certainly we didn't have the spring game this year. So we'll see. I haven't exactly figured out what I'm going to be writing about this week. But there will be something up at the site. And might even, one of the things that people have been talking about is if there's a shortened schedule, what does that look like? And you and I have sort of been bantering about back behind the scenes, would we be willing to accept a playoff structure for 1 year just because things were shortened a little bit? So might write about that a little bit and what it would look like if there were some schools that didn't open up or couldn't open up because of the coronavirus. What does college football look like? So certainly I wish I was writing about something other than that, but with coronavirus around, that's one of the things that I think is at the forefront of everybody's mind.
All right. That is Will Miles. You can find him on Twitter at Will Miles SEC and his site readandreaction.com. Go check his latest article out there, comparing, where Florida could be in relation to Clemson and Michigan and what they've done on the recruiting trail. I'm the host of Gators Breakdown, David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. Guys and girls out there, thanks for listening to this episode of Gators Breakdown.